I'm David Higgins. I'm the Professional Services Manager for CyberArk in the UK and Ireland, and I guess just want to kind of finish off this insider kind of session off by looking, I guess, in terms of how these kind of attacks kind of take place using, I guess, insider type privileges. But start off with some kind of hypothetical questions. You don't have to answer these, but just questions that maybe to think about if you've been asked these questions, which is, how do we make sure we're not the next one? We're not the next one in the news. Obviously, there's been lots of high-profile breaches recently. How do we ensure we're not the next organization that's in the news for that reason? And if we start putting those controls in place to make sure we're not that organization, how do we know that actually we're not under attack as we speak? How do we identify that? And if our perimeter is breached, are we confident that the heart of our enterprise is protected? And lots of conversations, as part of the panel session and before about, protecting critical assets, protecting the heart of the organization. How do we ensure, are we confident that we are controlling and protecting that? And the reason I bring that up is if we look at high-level snapshot, really, of the IT infrastructure and where the critical assets sit, so they might sit on a database, that sits on a server, that sits behind network infrastructure. When we start to break it down, actually each and every one of those pieces of software or infrastructure has a privileged account on it. Okay, so this is the piece that of interest to me, is that each of these systems have a privileged account. And the reason that they're of interest is that these are the ways that attackers look to get inside the organizations, how they, once they've breached the perimeter, and obviously we were talking about the perimeter essentially not being the final solution anymore. So once that perimeter is breached, then they're inside. What do they go after? Well, they go after the privileged accounts because they are the keys to the kingdom. They are the keys to the critical assets inside your enterprise. And as the quote shows here, this is what attackers are going after. This is part of their process. There is the way that they breach the infrastructure. And of course, if we're talking about the insider, then actually there's no breach needed. They're already inside. But what is it that they're after? Well, they're after these highly critical components for their attack, which is the privileged accounts to move around the infrastructure. Okay. So just kind of finishing off on that, it's pretty much the case in most of the breaches out there, or 100%, obviously, as you can see on the quote. It's privileged accounts that actually use a stolen credentials are used in those data breaches. And really, those credentials have to be for a privileged account because a privileged account is going to give them access to those sensitive assets that you've locked down. You've locked down on your databases and hardened servers and wrapped behind firewalls. It's the privileged accounts that are going to get the attackers to that point. So what I want to talk about really is, well, first point, addressing those questions I raised at the beginning is, well, what are privileged accounts? What are privileged access? And really, I think historically people have always summarized this as the kind of root in Unix or the administrator in Windows. And I've not actually shown these on the slide because they're the kind of de facto privileged accounts in the infrastructure. But really there's all these other types of accounts shown on the slide. And I think people's perception of privileges, it means different things to different people. But really privileges, the kind of access that allows you to alter or change or access sensitive information or access or alter a business service. So it could be the systems administrator account. So many organizations that I speak to, they've created two accounts for the domain administrators. One is their normal AD account that accesses Exchange, accesses the file shares as part of their role. But they may also have a secondary account that is something like .admin or .adm, or maybe it's a prefix as opposed to a suffix. But it's a secondary account that gives them administrative rights within the infrastructure. And what it does is it doubles up the JML process because there's now two accounts we have to manage, two accounts we have to monitor, there's two accounts we have to close when someone leaves, etc. We have third-party access, which was obviously a question that came up towards the end. How are third parties moving around and supporting systems that they're obviously serviced to do so? Well, typically they're using privileged accounts, and that may be generic ones, or they may be named accounts again. But often we see that they're shared because there's quite a high turnover in terms of shift patterns, etc., within third parties. We also see business applications coming up in conversation. If I'm a privileged user in SAP and I've got information or access to information about personal details, financial records, HR documents, etc., that in theory makes me a privileged user. So we see select business users coming up in this. And maybe more surprising on the far right-hand side, is social media. If the social media account for an organization is compromised, the Twitter account for a company or the Facebook account for a company, by a hacktivist or whoever it may be, then actually they can start, tweeting and doing Facebook updates, fairly offensive or defamatory stuff about that organization.